What is up, guys? Welcome back to the Crew 2, and in this video I will be going over my top 9 favorite hypercars to use in the game here. So there's definitely going to be some obvious ones in this list, but I also think there's going to be some nice hidden gems. Now, one thing I do want to mention though is I will be going over every single class as well at my top vehicles in each one, so definitely stay tuned for that in the near future. But nonetheless, guys, jumping right into this, we all know there's going to be a lot of good hypercars in the game. I mean, there is going to be 65 of them, with probably around half being Bugattis. Well, at least it kind of seems like that anyway. There is still going to be many decent vehicles in the hypercar category, even though many of them might end up falling into like a pit. I really do feel like many of these cars are actually going to be pretty dang good, even though most players are probably going to use certain vehicles over other ones, which honestly I can definitely understand why. I do feel like after testing out many of these hypercars when making this video, I can definitely see how some cars are going to be better than others and or why people would actually pick them. Now guys, the first vehicle I want to start off with here is going to be in ninth place. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say this is going to be like a list of like first to like ninth. It's more of like my top 9 overall vehicles for that matter, but nonetheless, guys, number 9 is going to be the KTM X-bow GTX, and the main reason why I put this vehicle in ninth place is most likely going to come down to the fact of it's not going to have the best overall speed compared to many of the other vehicles in the game. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be like the slowest vehicle when it comes to like its overall top speed, because the top speed on the KTM GTX is actually going to be pretty dang good. This vehicle, guys, with a nitrochem set is going to hit around 300 miles per hour, which is definitely not going to be the slowest hypercar by any means. But one thing I have noticed about the GTX when messing around with this vehicle just a little bit is probably going to be the overall speed that it does have. So it's going to be the overall acceleration when you guys are shifting through the gears. I would say some of the other hypercars are most likely going to be a better option. Now, it's kind of hilarious because before I was using the GTX pretty often in many of the events, and I was noticing that I was able to score pretty dang good with this vehicle in most of the summits I did test it out in. Sure, it's probably not going to be the fastest thing compared to like a Bugatti, but I really do think the GTX is going to be an insanely good car. Now, one of my favorite things about this is, for one, it's obviously going to be a KTM, and I'm slightly biased on KTM because I really do love them. I actually have a KTM motorcycle in real life, and I really do love their bikes. I'm also a huge fan of their dirt bikes as well, and the fact that they're making cars is honestly pretty awesome. But the handling of this car, guys, is going to be one of the best in the entire hypercar class. This thing is honestly insane, the way it can fly around corners and the way it can grip. I feel like a lot of players are most likely going to love the way this thing does handle. I do find the GTX to be insanely fun to use, especially on like these smaller type of events with all the cornering. I really do feel like that's going to be the main way this car is really going to shine, is the fact that the handling is definitely going to be insanely good. As I did mention, guys, of course the overall speed, like coming out of corners or maybe trying to accelerate like past 260, it might not be the greatest thing out there, but I do still feel like it's going to be a great competitor. I do find this pretty interesting because I really don't see many people use this vehicle, especially in summits. Obviously, most of the summits right now are most likely going to be the Tempesta, which I really can't argue the fact of that car being so insanely good. And it's kind of funny because that vehicle is going to be in this list, but I really do feel like the GTX is going to be worth a look, especially if you guys do want to drive something a bit different. This car really is going to be insanely unique. For one, it's obviously fully carbon fiber, which instantly made me think about that one meme. But one of the biggest factors of the GTX, guys, on why I think many people don't use it, is there is probably going to be a few better options than this vehicle overall with how they do drive. But I really do feel like the handling of this GTX is definitely going to be worth a look, and if you guys were concerned if this vehicle is going to be good enough in summits, I would probably say you can easily get a good score like over 125k plus on most of the events with this vehicle, and easily compete to get platinum with this car, especially if you guys do want to drive something different. I really do feel like a lot of people are most likely tired of using the meta vehicles, but overall, guys, I would definitely say the GTX is going to be worth a look. And now coming in at 8th place is going to be the Porsche 918 Spyder Silvery Edition. So the one thing about this car, guys, unfortunately, is going to be the fact that it was an old Motor Pass vehicle, so you can't actually just go and buy this car, but I would say the regular 918 is also going to be pretty dang good as well. I may end up testing out that car more in the future, but my goodness, guys, this wide body Silvery Edition from that Motor Pass, I really do feel like kind of fell into that pit that I was mentioning earlier. Now, one thing about the Silvery Edition that I found to be insanely impressive is going to be its top speed. Now, we all know the Bugattis tend to be like the fastest vehicles in the game because, well, it's a Bugatti. But I would say the Porsche is probably going to be up there, guys. This thing does 313 miles per hour, making it one of the faster hypercars in the game because, for example, the GTX can barely hit 300. You basically have to go through all of your nitrous, even with a nitrochemist set, so I would definitely say the Porsche is going to be pretty dang impressive, and it easily can compete with some of the better hypercars with that higher top speed. Now, the top speed of the Silvery Edition is definitely going to be nothing short of impressive, but to be honest, guys, the first thing I noticed when I jumped into this car and started doing some races with it is going to be the stability and handling that this thing does have. So I'm sure a lot of people have noticed many of the hypercars, even the Bugattis, for example, tend to lose themselves insanely easy going over like hills and or like uneven ground. And even going around the corner the wrong way in some of these hypercars can also send you into a helicopter in distress, so I would definitely say it's going to be something to look into with some of the handling and or stability in these vehicles. But my goodness, guys, the Silvery Edition not only has a great top speed, but I feel like the handling and stability of this vehicle is definitely going to be very shocking to most players. One thing I also really like about this vehicle is the fact that it does look pretty awesome. If you guys were wondering, by the way, the wide body kit on the Silvery Edition is not available on the regular 918, so this car is definitely going to be pretty unique, and I really do feel like the wide body kit on this vehicle does actually help it a bit, which is kind of funny considering the one on the Chiron and or Chiron, whatever you actually want to call that Bugatti. The body kit on that one from the Icon Level 1000, I feel like was honestly not that great. I don't really like the way that car does handle, but my goodness, the 918 Silvery Edition is definitely going to be worth a look. It might even be one of the best hypercars in the class when it comes to stability. And now moving over to 7th place, guys, is going to be the Lamborghini Reveton. What's kind of funny is I really haven't used this car much when it actually released, but I started to run it more often. I do have to admit I feel like this car is definitely going to be worth a look, so a lot of people might be wondering, is this car actually going to be worth using? And well, the funniest thing about the Reventon to me is every time I look at this vehicle, I instantly think about Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2010. My goodness, the memories with this car on that game. But one of the first things I normally do with hypercars is to see what they can actually get to as a top speed to really see how they might compete. Some of the cars can do like 295, like 297, but one thing I was kind of shocked about, guys, is the Lamborghini Reveton is going to do around 314 miles per hour with a nitrochemist set, so this thing is definitely going to be pretty dang fast compared to many of the other hypercars. It's going to have a very similar top speed to the 918 Silvery Edition, which in a lot of ways I can definitely see how they're going to be similar with that top speed. The Reventon's also going to be iconic in some way because I would say many people who actually played Hot Pursuit are most likely insanely excited to see this car in the Crew 2, but not only, guys, is this car going to look really good, but I feel like a lot of players are going to love the way this thing handles. I would say one of the biggest concerns with many of the hypercars is the fact that is this thing going to get around a corner without turning into a fidget spinner when trying to get around it. I really do feel like some of the cars are going to be insanely bad with that, and going over like the slightest hill in some cars kind of makes me a bit mad because the thing just loses itself so quick. I really do feel like the Revent is not really going to fall into that category. One thing I also did notice is the overall stability, like going back and forth or in corners, or maybe trying to dodge some insanely annoying pedestrians on the road. This car is really going to shine in so many aspects of that, guys, so overall I would probably say the Reventon's definitely going to be worth a look if you guys want something different to drive, or maybe you're a big fan of Lamborghini and you might be wanting to use one of these cars in the hypercar class. I would honestly say most of the Lamborghinis in this class are probably not going to be the greatest thing you might want to run. For example, the newer Countach definitely looks awesome, but that car didn't make it on this list because I didn't find it to be better than the Reveton. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of how good Lamborghinis are in the street class, but unfortunately it's going to be slightly different. Now you guys can definitely run the Reveton in basically any of the summits as well, because the Reventon's going to be insanely competitive in most of the events. I'm not gonna lie guys, I really don't use the Bugattis all that much in this game, even though they're going to be insanely good. I really do like messing around with different vehicles to actually see what they can do, and when I was running the Reventon I was like, you know what? This car is actually going to be insanely good. Not only do we have a nice high top speed that is actually pretty dang close to the Bugatti Divo, it's also going to have great handling and stability as well, so I would definitely say it's going to be a great overall vehicle. I have noticed how some cars might struggle in their overall speed and or top speed as well, and then their handling might actually be pretty decent, like for example the GTX. That thing's going to have a higher top speed but a lower overall speed, but insanely good handling, so trying to find a vehicle that can actually do all of it is always going to be a challenge. But to be honest guys, if you're looking for an overall car that can also compete in summits, this car is also going to be really good for grinding out money and or followers, or maybe you guys might be trying to grind out some parts as well. I feel like the Reventon is by far going to be worth a look. And now moving over to 6th place is going to be one of my personal favorite hypercars in the entire game. The Proto Lucky-One, guys. I might even go as far as saying this thing's going to be pretty underrated. Now, of course, this car is going to have one unfortunate drawback to it. You actually cannot get this vehicle at the moment because it was part of an older motor pass, which honestly could make its return before Motorfest comes out, but I would also say this car may not actually make a return because it's really not going to be all that old because it wasn't a recent motor pass that's not insanely long ago. But I really do feel like this car kind of just like slipped under the rug a little bit because I really don't see anybody use it. I would actually say the Proto Lucky-One, guys, is probably like top 3 in the hypercar class. When it comes to its overall handling and stability, I would actually choose the Proto Lucky-One over most of the other hypercars in the game. Of course, this thing's going to have a pretty weird looking interior, but past that guys, I would actually say this car is going to sound similar to a Bugatti. And what's kind of funny is the top speed of this Proto is going to be around 308 miles per hour, which is definitely not going to make it the slowest. I would say it's going to fall into like a sweet spot when it comes to its overall top speed because it's not going to be slow, like 295 miles per hour, even though that's not really that slow. But then again, I feel like having a hypercar that can do over 300 miles per hour, which talking about in a real life standpoint doesn't honestly make that much sense, but in the Crew 2 you're probably going to want something like that for the longer races. I would say for these shorter ones you're probably going to want to aim for like handling mixed with like really good overall speed as well. So I remember a while back when we had that one summit that had that touring car mixed with a hypercar event. I really do wish we can actually use like hypercars in touring car races and like vice versa. My goodness, that would be so much fun. But I remember doing that one touring car event when driving the Proto Lucky-One, and I could not believe how good this car was going around that track. Like, I was having such a great time flying around the track with this vehicle that in a way I kind of forgot it was actually a hypercar, which is definitely going to sound pretty interesting, guys. But the stability on the Proto Lucky-One, I would also say is going to be top tier easily compared to many of the other hypercars. It's kind of funny because after I did that event in the summit, I immediately started to want to do some hyper races with the Proto Lucky-One. I was having such a great time driving this vehicle, and of course the Proto's going to look kind of odd. I do think we can all agree with that, but overall I do like how the rims look on this vehicle. I also mentioned earlier I would probably say this thing's going to be another version of a Bugatti, almost like its long lost cousin. I think this is probably going to be like a new Gotti because it's basically similar to it. It's going to have like the same type of like exit with the nitrous. So who knows, maybe this might actually be a Bugatti with a futuristic looking body on it. But regardless guys, if you did get the Proto Lucky-One from that older motor pass, I would highly recommend trying this thing out because my goodness, this is by far going to be one of the best handling hypercars in the entire game. And now moving over to 5th place, I honestly had a rough decision with this vehicle because my goodness guys, the McLaren Senna is obviously going to be a top tiered vehicle in the hypercar category, but overall I would say a lot of people are really going to love this car. It's kind of funny because I really haven't used the Senna that much in the past, but that may end up changing in the future though, because I was noticing in many of the summits that seemed to be no restriction, many of the players were actually using the Senna, so I really had to jump in and try this thing out, and I can actually see why so many people really do love to use this vehicle. Funnily enough, when I first saw this car, I actually thought it was the Sienna, and then I immediately realized that's actually a Toyota minivan, but when it comes to the top speed of this car, guys, it's going to be around 297 miles per hour. So unfortunately, yes, it is going to be under that 300 mile per hour mark, but I really don't think that's going to matter all that much with what I've seen with this car so far. To some, I would say the McLaren Senna is probably going to be kind of too slow for the longer hypercar events, which to a certain extent, depending on who you might be racing with, that could honestly be slightly true. But I really do feel like, guys, on these smaller type of tracks, I think this car is going to completely annihilate many of the hypercars. For me, I would say the one car that does compete with the Senna, at least from the testing I have done, is easily going to be the Proto Lucky-One. Now, the main reason why I say that is the way both of these cars handle, I feel like is going to be very similar. They both feel like they actually stick to the ground completely, and you also feel like you have a lot of confidence with the way they do have their stability set up. I'm kind of amazed with how good the Senna is going to be around a track, which is kind of funny, considering this car is also going to be insanely good on a track in real life as well, so that's probably going to be why so many people actually run this vehicle in many of the events, especially in summits, because the handling is going to be that good. Now, I'm not saying you can't actually use this vehicle on like longer hyper events, but I really do think it's going to come down to who you guys are racing with and or against. If you guys were to do like the Detroit race, for example, and you're going to be using the Senna versus like the 300 Super Sport and like a Divo, you will most likely get destroyed by those cars on like the longer highway areas, but when it does come to like these shorter turns and like these smaller parts of the races, I really do feel like the McLaren's going to shine tremendously on those. I was noticing, guys, when like some of the races were mixed together, like using a hypercar on a street event, most of the vehicles I saw being used was indeed the Senna because of the way this thing handled, and when I was running this vehicle I could honestly see why. Like, the Senna is definitely going to be worth a look. At the same time though, I also feel like a lot of people are still going to be using the Senna even to this day, with the Bugattis being as good as they are, and also one of the recent cars known as the Tempesta that's kind of taken over the hypercar category. But even with some cars having a lower top speed, I would say something like the Senna is definitely going to be one of those cars you might want to keep an eye on. And now moving over to fourth place is going to be the Bugatti Veyron 16.4 Grand Sport Vitesse. Maybe it's actually Vitesse, I really don't know. Maybe it's like tomato tomato. But regardless, guys, this car also gives me lots of memories from Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012. I absolutely love driving this car on that game, but I feel like this is going to be another one of those hypercars that many players probably forget about. I honestly most likely would be one of those as well, because I did not use this vehicle that much when it actually released. I've been messing around with it more in different summits and stuff, and I'm honestly really impressed. And not only that, guys, it is going to be a Bugatti, so you probably are going to expect a pretty high speed with it. The top speed of the Bugatti 16.4 is going to be around 319 miles per hour, which is going to be basically the exact same as the Bugatti Divo, and also not that far behind from the fastest hypercar in the game, which is the 300 Super Sport. So the Veyron 16.4 is definitely going to be no stranger to a higher top speed, but even though some of these cars might have a higher top speed, doesn't necessarily make them that good. I was testing this vehicle out a good amount on different events, guys, and I really do have to admit, for being a Bugatti, this car is going to handle insanely well. I did notice going over some types of uneven ground, like little hills and stuff, if you do try to turn in those, I did notice the car might turn into a tornado. But besides that, it's not going to be insanely bad though, at least compared to some of the other Bugattis I have tested out. I really do think the Veyron's going to be one of the better ones, and I feel like this car is actually kind of underrated. I really never see anybody run this vehicle, and it is kind of entertaining to use. It's going to handle insanely well, plus the stability is going to be pretty dang good. One thing I also did notice though is of course the speed of a Bugatti is going to be insane, so you can basically fly out of corners and or get on them straightaways and basically do like 300 plus miles an hour. I also don't know how that kind of sounded like a country song, but I really do think the Veyron's going to be one of the better Bugattis in the game, and also one of the more underrated ones as well, because I really never see anybody run this thing. But I have to admit guys, I do definitely recommend trying out the Bugatti Veyron. And if you guys were a fan of Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012, I'm sure you probably do remember driving this Bugatti in there. That car was an absolute blast, and I feel like it's going to be insanely fun on the Crew 2 as well. I really like the fact of this car being able to be used in summits, but you can also jump into races like the Hollywood Hypercar race and or the Detroit and or Dallas one, and still get an insanely good score with the Bugatti, but also a really good time, because this car is going to be insanely fast, not only with its handling, but also with that top speed. And now moving over to number 3, I have a feeling is not going to be that shocking to most players. For me guys, it's going to be the Bugatti Divo. I would almost say you could probably have an entire list of Bugattis, which might actually be a separate video. I guess you can also say that's kind of going to be a brain blast there, but man, that show was awesome back in the day. But nonetheless, guys, the Bugatti Divo is most likely going to be a fan favorite because my goodness, guys, this car has probably remained one of the best hypercars for an insanely long time here on the Crew 2, so I'm sure you guys do know that the Bugatti Divo is going to not only be one of the fastest cars, at least I guess you can say most cars do actually compete with this thing now, but for a while there the Divo was actually one of the best overall and fastest cars to use in this class. The top speed of the Divo is going to be around 320 miles per hour, making it basically around the same as the Bugatti Veyron 16.4, so they're actually going to be pretty dang similar. And one thing I found pretty interesting is I actually prefer the 16.4 over the Bugatti, which I would say is going to be kind of shocking. Now the main reason why I say this guys is yes, I really do like the Divo on the Crew 2. I also feel like in some ways this car is going to have some flaws to it. The biggest thing with that is by far going to be the way this thing does handle. I kind of feel like in some way the Bugatti Divo is not only going to be a really fun but also kind of an annoying vehicle to use. It's kind of like a love-hate relationship with this car. Like you probably do know it's going to be insanely reliable when you actually do summits and stuff and or like longer hyper events, because you obviously can't go wrong with picking a Bugatti. Now I have drove the Bugatti Divo a good amount. I mean, I have over 1,000 miles with this vehicle on the Crew 2, so I can definitely say I do think this car is still going to be one of the best hypercars in the game, but with the new vehicles being released and or different cars now being used on the game a lot more often, you could probably go as far as saying that you might actually have better options now than when this car was actually initially being used the most. I've been finding myself messing around with many different hypercars on the game, and I actually rarely use the Bugatti Divo now guys unless I absolutely have to on a summit. I basically never really run this car like I used to because I've been using things like the GTX or the Silvery edition and sometimes even like the Bugatti 16.4, which for some odd reason I really do find that car to be a lot more enjoyable than this one. I feel like the biggest thing guys between both Bugattis is by far going to be the way they handle. For some odd reason, I find the 16.4 to be a lot more fun than the Divo. Now, I'm not saying the Divo is a bad car in any way, because I would still probably recommend using this vehicle on basically any of the summits if you are missing some of the other cars that were out in motor passes, and or you don't feel like buying the Super Sport 300 Plus because of how insane that thing is. But then again, I also feel like we're probably going to be at a point where most people would end up buying the Super Sport over the Divo, but I do want to know what you guys think in the comments below. Would you buy the Divo over the Super Sport and or vice versa? I really feel like you can't go wrong with the Divo because this car has basically been like one of the best hypercars in the game for an insanely long time now. Like this is actually one of my favorite hypercars, which I did make a video on probably around like I don't even know, maybe 10 months ago or something, might have been longer, of this being my favorite overall hypercar in the game, which I would most likely say that might end up changing now. I might be doing like an updated video with all of those, but even with all these new cars being released and or better cars actually coming out of the pit, I would still say the Bugatti Divo is still going to be an insanely strong competitor. And then moving over to number 2 is going to be the Creators Tempesta. So I feel like this car kind of took the hypercar class by storm. And honestly, guys, I can probably see how that's going to be a thing because this thing is honestly insane. I almost put this car in first place, but I'm sure everybody probably knows what first place is probably going to be, mainly because of the top speed of that vehicle. But the Creators Tempesta is not only going to look absolutely insane, which I've been kind of mixed on the looks of this vehicle, but I also kind of think it looks pretty awesome. It's also going to be insanely unique, similar to something like you would see on GTA Online. And not only that, guys, the Creators Tempesta is also probably going to be the new quote-unquote meta vehicle. So one of the first things I wanted to see with the Creators Tempesta was indeed going to be the top speed of this vehicle. So when testing it out, guys, with a Nitrochemist set, you can get the Creators Tempesta to around 315 miles per hour, making it definitely one of the faster hypercars. It will also put it around 4 to 5 miles per hour slower than most of the Bugattis, so it's definitely going to be a great competitor. But honestly, guys, the biggest thing about the Tempesta, I would say, is going to be similar to something like the Proto Lucky-One. The handling on this car, guys, is going to be insanely good. I think that's most likely why this car is basically going to be the new meta in the game. I'm sure a lot of people have been noticing on most of the summits recently that it's basically covered in the Tempesta. One thing I definitely cannot lie about is I really don't use this car at any of the summits. Even though it's probably going to be one of the better options for most of the events, I feel like this is also going to come down to the overall speed of this car being insanely good as well. I have noticed with certain vehicles, even though they might have a lower top speed, they can also have like overall speed that's going to be insanely good. I feel like a great example of this is going to be the McLaren Senna. That car only does like 297 miles per hour, but the overall speed and handling is going to put it miles ahead of the competition, especially on these shorter tracks. I would say the Tempesta is also going to be a great competitor to the Senna. My goodness, guys, the Creators Tempesta is definitely going to be one of the weirdest cars we've ever had. Similar to the Proto Lucky-One, but also going to be one of the better ones. And also one of those vehicles you most likely would never expect it to be insanely good. And of course it's going to be a motor pass car as well, so it's definitely going to be on the rare side. I would say some of these old motor pass vehicles are by far going to be worth using, especially if you guys have been on the fence about trying them out recently with some of the better cars that are in the game. I would definitely recommend trying out something like the Tempesta, mainly because the Creators Tempesta is by far going to be at the top of the hypercar category, and I would say it's most likely going to remain that way for quite a long time. But even with this car looking kind of odd, guys, I did see some people talking about that. Once again, let me know in the comments below what car you guys think this thing is actually based on. I'm still trying to figure this out to this day, but overall, guys, with the interesting looks on this vehicle, I really do think the handling and stability mixed with that higher top speed is still going to make this one of the best hypercars, if not the best in many regards. And now finally, moving over to number 1, which I had a feeling is not going to be insanely shocking to many. But once again, guys, I didn't really do this top 9 as like this being the best overall vehicle. It's more of like my favorite top 9 vehicles you can actually run. But overall, guys, I would say the Super Sport 300 Plus kind of does deserve being in first place here. This is obviously going to be the fastest hypercar in the game. Also tying a top speed with some of the drag cars, which is awful. But the top speed on this vehicle is going to be 335 miles per hour with a Nitrochemist set. So the Super Sport is by far not going to be a slow car in any regards, and obviously going to be insanely fast as well. So when testing out the Bugatti, guys, I would say this thing is going to have an edge in some areas. So first off, I would say the handling on this thing is probably not going to be the greatest at higher speeds. I noticed the 300 does tend to like get kind of fishtaily and stuff as well, and it just doesn't really like going over uneven ground and stuff like that. So do keep that in mind if you guys are driving this car pretty often. But one thing I really do love about the Bugatti is the fact that you're doing around 285 miles per hour and you still have another gear you have to go into and actually shift, which is kind of funny considering the overall top speed on this vehicle is 305. My goodness, Dade County. But Nonetheless, guys, I really do think the Bugatti is by far going to be a lot more used than, let's say, the 16.4 Veyron and or the Divo. Now, the 16.4 Veyron's obviously going to be a tad cheaper. I believe that car is a little over $1.1 million, and if I do remember correctly, I do believe the Divo's over $2 million, so that's a pretty big jump there with how much the cars actually cost, but I really do feel like it does come down to what you guys actually like and or what you actually want to race, and I feel like on the really long hyper races, I have such a good time running the Super Sport. For some odd reason, it's so much fun flying down the highway doing 320 miles an hour, and you're basically at like a cruising speed in your 7th gear doing 285, so you can definitely tell how fast this car is going to be when you're racing it on these longer events like the Dallas race, and or something like the long New York race as well. I feel like this car is going to be great for those. You can also find yourself completing these events a lot faster because the car is going to have that higher speed to it. It honestly might not be a bad idea to farm like part sets and or, money and followers driving something like the Super Sport on these longer hyper events. And not only that, guys, you can also jump into many of the summits and still easily compete with this vehicle and basically everything else. One thing I did notice, guys, with this Bugatti is for these shorter events, all you actually have to do with this thing is lower the gearbox by 1 point. Now doing that is going to make the acceleration of this Bugatti a lot faster. Funnily enough, I did notice most of the Bugattis don't tend to accelerate all that great, so maybe lowering the gearbox on all of them might not be the baddest idea, but doing that on the 300 Super Sport, guys, is going to make this thing so much faster on those shorter events. That's most likely why I see most of the leaderboards covered in the Super Sport. And what's kind of hilarious is not only can you do these shorter events with this thing, you can then jump into the longer ones and completely own those as well. So the Super Sport is by far going to easily be #1 on this list just because it's so dang versatile. You can basically race this thing everywhere, and I would also say one of the craziest things about this car is the fact that we actually have a Super Sport 300 Plus on the Crew 2. I honestly was really shocked when I saw this car coming into the game. I really couldn't believe it. But seeing the Super Sport 300 Plus actually being added into the game, I really do wonder if we can possibly see the Koenigsegg Absolute in Motorfest. I guess we're allowed to dream just a little bit, but overall, guys, I would say my top 9 vehicles in the hypercar class are by far going to be insanely good options, regardless of which car you guys really do like the most. Now, one thing I did mention earlier is I do tend to stay away from like the quote-unquote meta vehicles. Now, it's not like I don't actually like these cars or anything, because the Bugatti Super Sport 300 Plus is an absolute blast to use. Funnily enough, guys, I actually run this car pretty often when I'm doing hyper races besides the summits. I really do find them insanely fun to use, but when it does come to the summits, I try to stay away from these vehicles because I know a lot of players might not actually have these vehicles at their disposal and or the money to buy them. So I do try to show that you can do these events driving different cars that you might not see all that often, and to see how some of these older vehicles might compete with some of the better ones. In ways, I do feel like these top 9 vehicles are probably going to be pretty shocking to many, but I also feel like they're going to be insanely good, even though most of these cars are going to be on the rare side. At least seeing them around, I really do not see many of these cars used that much at all, except for some of them. Not looking you, Tempesta and or Bugatti Super Sport, but overall, guys, I do want to know your thoughts on this in the comments below. What is your favorite car out of the 9 vehicles I did choose? And if I did not include your favorite hypercar in the list, do let me know what that is in the comments below. I really do feel like you can't go wrong with picking any of these cars, but I would say some are going to have advantages over the others.